In colonial America, executive power was held by a distant hereditary king who was increasingly seen as tyrannical. During the American Revolution, the people decided that such a strong executive was unnecessary, so they weakened state governors and decided to do without any kind of national executive. It turned out this did not go so well, leading the framers of the Constitution in 1787 to try to figure out how to get the good aspects of a strong executive while avoiding the bad. My name is Michael Faber, and I'm an associate professor of political science at Texas State University. And I'm here to talk about how presidential elections were discussed during the Philadelphia Convention of 1787 and the debates over whether to ratify the Constitution. And I want to talk a little bit as well about the first presidential elections and what those tell us about the intent of those who wrote the Constitution. So under the Articles of Confederation, before the Constitution, the former English colonists dispensed with executives altogether. They decided they didn't really need a chief executive in place to have a functioning national government. Instead, what they had was a simple confederal assembly where each state sent delegates and the delegates had equal votes. That assembly then delegated some executive power to ministers. And in the meantime, the states had all essentially established weak governors. There was some variation among the states in terms of how they did this, but in general, these were popularly elected governors that were carefully controlled. Now, it turns out neither of these solutions worked particularly well. The framers of the Constitution saw the importance of the executive. They saw that they needed it because of its clear absence in the 1780s. But the problem was to create a position that was strong enough to effectively exercise executive power, but not strong enough to become tyrannical. This, of course, is all well known by anyone with at least passing knowledge of the writing of the Constitution. However, what's not always clear is that the key to this, the most important part of this, was figuring out who would choose the president and how. And this was a difficult discussion. This was something the convention spent a great deal of time on and really struggled to come up with a suitable choice. For starters, the convention starts out with what came to be known as the Virginia Plan. The Virginia Plan, among other provisions, and I'm not going to go over the entire convention here, but among other provisions, called for a president and chief executive to be elected by Congress. This president was to be elected on a 7-year term with no eligibility for re-election. The idea here is to establish independence, was to enable Congress to choose someone qualified, but make sure that the president was not beholden to Congress and therefore simply willing to do Congress's bidding. There was at least some sentiment in the convention suggesting that the president should, in fact, do Congress's bidding. Roger Sherman of Connecticut, for example, said as much. He said that he wanted election by the legislature in order to make the executive dependent upon the legislature. This is, of course, not a crazy, ridiculous idea. In fact, it's what we see in most Western democracies today that have parliamentary systems where the executive is fundamentally dependent upon the legislature for his very continuance in office. But most of the framers saw good reason to have an independent executive, to have a president who could do things independently of Congress and could push back against Congress when necessary. And so the Virginia Plan was trying to establish this independence while still having Congress choose the executive. As a minor side note, the New Jersey Plan, which was presented as an alternative to the Virginia Plan, called for Congress to elect an executive council. Here, too, these advocates for keeping the Articles of Confederation and merely amending them, they were calling for an executive and calling for one that was at least a little bit independent, but Congress would still have the power to appoint and to recall these people. And so, again, there was really a push to have an executive that was reliant on the legislature, but it seems that most of the delegates favored a relatively independent executive. That said, election by Congress was always going to create at least potential, or at the very least, the appearance of being dependent on Congress, that in fact the executive was chosen because of some pre-existing favor with Congress. And so a number of the delegates were not entirely comfortable with legislative selection. Some went so far as to suggest direct popular election. James Wilson of Pennsylvania was the strongest proponent of this. What's interesting is James Wilson was not really among the most democratic of the delegates. And in fact, he's widely seen as supporting of aristocracy, as a little bit elitist. But what was significant about James Wilson is he was an advocate of strong presidential power. And for the president to be strong and independent, Wilson felt that the president needed to owe his office to nobody, if at all possible. And direct election by the people was the way to make sure that the president did not owe any favors to particular electors, because each voter who voted for him, there's so many of them, they couldn't possibly exert any kind of pressure over the president. Wilson was not the only advocate of direct elections. Gouverneur Morris was also a big proponent of a strong presidency and also wanted to see direct elections. But direct elections never really gained a whole lot of traction. There were just too many drawbacks. Now, there is a prevailing myth that the problem with direct elections was that the framers of the Constitution disliked democracy, that they were afraid that the people might make bad choices. This doesn't actually fit with what happened at the convention. If they were afraid of democracy, they would not have had a directly elected House of Representatives, for example. The problem was not that they didn't want the people to speak. The problem was not that an election could not be held. I mean, the votes could be taken at local polling places and aggregated to the state level and then the national level. A direct election as president was certainly possible. The concern was with voters. Now, voters in the 1780s were relatively plugged in. Well, not so much, it's sort of an anachronistic term to use, but they certainly were aware of politics. The problem was politics for most of them consisted of the politics of their towns and cities. For some of the ones that were more politically aware, it consisted of the politics of their states. The number of people who really understood and paid attention to national, much less international politics, was pretty small. And so the concern that many of the delegates to the convention had was that a typical voter might well know who in his town was most qualified to represent him. He might well know who in his state was most qualified to represent him and do a good job as a chief executive. But it was very unlikely all that many voters would have a clear sense of who nationally would be a good choice for president of the United States. And so the concern was not that voters weren't knowledgeable. The concern was that voters' knowledge was focused on the local rather than the national. And if voters voted accordingly, well, maybe voters in Massachusetts would know of a good candidate from Connecticut. Maybe voters in South Carolina would know of a good candidate from North Carolina. This is a possibility. But the chances of a voter in Massachusetts knowing of suitable candidates from the Carolinas was pretty small, and vice versa. And so the worry here was that if everybody was voting directly, they would vote for someone local or someone in their state, someone in their region at the very least. And what we'd end up with would be at least 5 or 6 viable candidates who all received some votes. And the chance of getting any kind of national consensus would be very, very small. Either we'd have to accept a president who might have 20, 25% of the national vote, or we'd have to have some tiebreaker process anyway, which would probably happen in Congress. And in that case, if nobody had a majority and went to Congress, that was pretty much the same as Congress electing. So the idea of a direct popular election was undesirable for these reasons. It just wasn't really that feasible to get voters to have sufficient knowledge of national politics. Of course, this changes relatively quickly, and I'll come back to that. But this is the main reason that Wilson's push for direct popular election never really came to be. Now, to be fair, there was certainly some elitism present in the convention. Certainly, there were some who thought that the people really were not qualified to make a decision. One noteworthy line here, George Mason at one point, according to Madison's notes, said that, quote, "It would be as unnatural to refer the choice of a proper character for chief magistrate, that is the president, to the people as it would to refer a trial of colors to a blind man." George Mason tended to wear his elitism on his sleeve more often than not. He certainly thought that the idea of a direct election was just preposterous, that the people would not make good choices. But this was not the prevailing attitude. The prevailing attitude was, yes, it'd be nice to have a president directly elected, but the people just don't have the national knowledge to be able to do that. So with the direct election out, that left this legislative election. In fact, the reason legislative election was the choice of the convention for a while, was the prevailing option, was simply because between these two options, most delegates saw legislative election as better might not be the best word. We'll say less bad, less problematic. Um, the advocates for direct election pushed back. I mean, Gouverneur Morris, for example, made the argument that the people could not be as easily swayed by would-be tyrants or demagogues as, say, Congress could. That it's fewer people that one has to persuade, fewer people one has to bribe if one wanted to try to win election through that route. And so election by Congress, he said, was more liable to corruption, more liable to demagoguery. Most did not agree with him, but frankly, most of the convention was looking for some other alternative, some other way out of this. There were other suggestions made. In general, the suggestions emphasized the role of the states. Elbridge Gerry, for instance, suggested that the state governors might elect the president. Possibly state governors could vote, have voting power weighted by population of their states. Oliver Ellsworth at one point suggested that the state legislatures could simply pick electors. And what he wanted to see was to see each state have relatively equal votes, but maybe have smaller states get 2 votes and larger states 3, or somewhere along those lines, where the larger states got a slight advantage, but not equal to their size. James Wilson, realizing that his direct election was not going to work, at one point proposed a 2-stage process where the people would elect electors who would then elect the president. This, of course, is an early version of what would eventually be passed, would eventually become part of the Constitution. The Electoral College that actually ends up in the Constitution is worth discussing, worth breaking down a little bit, because understanding the reasons why it was done the way that it was done is, I think, very important. In the initial version, now remember, this was changed in the 12th Amendment, so relatively quickly. It lasted all of 4 elections before we changed how we did it. But in the original version, each state would get electors equal to its congressional delegation. That means House of Representative members plus Senate members. This was quite clearly a compromise between large states and small states. It would slightly overrepresent small states while still giving large states the bulk of the power. But the Constitution says that the states get to decide how these electors are chosen. This is an important and often overlooked point. The framers at the convention generally agreed that the people would ultimately be the ones to choose the electors. And that, in fact, the people should be the ones to choose the electors. But there were some, like Ellsworth, I mentioned before, and also folks like Mason and to an extent Gerry, who wanted to see this decision taken out of the hands of the people, wanted to see more qualified electors even to choose the presidential electors. And so the convention deliberately left this vague and said it's up to the states to decide how the electors will be chosen. States could decide simply to assign a slate of electors from the legislature. States could decide to have direct popular election of electors. They could decide to do this on an individual elector basis. They could decide to do this on a winner-take-all kind of system where a whole slate got elected. There's a lot of different ways that one might do this. It is important to note that the Constitution prohibits federal office holders from serving as electors. This is very clearly designed to prevent some of the drawbacks of congressional election. What we wanted to avoid is the president to be beholden for his office to any federal office holders. So these electors, once chosen, they would meet in their state. And the Constitution is actually fairly clear about this. They meet in their state on the same day. So every state's having this meeting the same day. They do not deliberate. They do not come in and toss out ideas for who would be a good president. They merely cast votes for 2 candidates. One of those candidates must be from some state other than the elector state. The idea here is going back to that concern that we'd have a whole bunch of different candidates from different states, and that each state would support its own favorite son. By forcing each elector to choose at least one person from outside the state, what that enables is the possibility of truly national candidates, that electors will need to know people from outside the state. We still could get regional biases here. It could be that electors from Massachusetts always choose candidates from the Northeast, or that Southern states always choose Southern candidates. But at least it opens it up beyond just each state kind of picking their own. It is important too, and the electors meet on the same day everywhere. This was about eliminating the possibility for corruption. If there's a bunch of independent meetings that don't even involve deliberation, it becomes much more difficult to try to reach out and try to persuade anybody because it has to be done on an individual basis across all of the states. Now, this is not necessarily a tremendously powerful check, but again, it's a lot of little things like this that the framers put into place to minimize the possibility for corruption in this process. Once the electors have cast their vote, those votes are tallied in the state level and sealed and sent to Congress, where the president and the Senate opens them up officially in front of a joint meeting of Congress. Again, the idea here is a certain amount of transparency. The idea here is to minimize the possibility for corruption. And if somebody wins a majority of the electors or wins a vote, at least one vote, or wins one vote from at least a majority of the electors, then that person is elected president. However, the Constitution does allow for a backup process. The House of Representatives can break a tie if there are two candidates with the same number of electoral votes and it's both a majority. Um, or the House may choose from the top five candidates if there is no majority, if no one has a majority. Now, of course, this has changed with the 12th Amendment, but at the time, the idea here was to allow for a lot of candidates so the House had some flexibility. Many of the delegates to the Philadelphia Convention seem to have believed that this would become standard practice, that nobody would get a majority in the Electoral College most of the time. If there was a broad national consensus expressed through that majority, so be it. If there was not, then the House could work it out. The House could break the ties. Um, why five? I mean, five's kind of an arbitrary number. There were some delegates to the convention who pushed to reduce this number to say, well, maybe the House should choose from the top three candidates, for example. But there were also some that pushed back and said, no, five, if anything, is too small. Why not give them a full choice of all the candidates who received electoral votes? Why not give them seven candidates, eight candidates, 12 candidates? There's no particular reason to limit it. And so five was something of a compromise, as giving the House a wide variety of choices based on the people's election, but making sure that it was limited to those that actually received more than a handful of votes. So the House couldn't simply go against what the people had suggested. So there were a number of delegates who thought of this as the Electoral College as a nominating process, and that the House would then decide. Of course, it hasn't worked out that way for the most part. And then after the president is chosen, whether he's chosen by a majority of the electors or chosen in the House, the person with the most votes remaining becomes vice president. Now, this is something that's often forgotten, but in the original writing of this, if somebody wins a plurality of votes from the electors, somebody wins more votes than anyone else, and then loses a House vote because they didn't have a majority in the Electoral College, that person would automatically become vice president. So coming out ahead initially in the votes would guarantee someone at least the number two spot. That's the way that was set up. And I'm not sure that there's a whole lot of reason for that beyond just not wanting to give the Senate too much additional power in this process. But if there is a tie, it is the Senate that breaks the tie. Of course, this is not how we do it now. Has changed with the 12th Amendment. But the idea here uh, was to give the House some say in this. And I forgot to mention, the House, when they vote on the president, they're voting by state. So again, it's balancing out a lot of competing interests. The smaller states pushed for equal votes. Actually, they pushed for the election of the president to be in the Senate. But the idea that the Senate would choose the president again was just putting a little bit too much power in the already powerful Senate. And so it gets pushed off to the House voting by state. So what does this Electoral College compromise do? Well, it does a few things. First of all, it does give the people a role. The framers always intended electors to be elected by the people. They don't have to be. The states could just choose their electors, but in general, the expectation was that they would not. Second advantage of this compromise is it does make the president independent because electors cannot be federal office holders. And even if Congress makes the ultimate decision, the president is still chosen from those top vote getters in the Electoral College and still needs to have that support outside of Congress, can't merely try to garner support inside of Congress. A third aspect of this is a federal aspect, that states do have a role in the process. They were intended to, and almost everybody at the convention wanted to make sure that they would have a role in the process. And then a fourth advantage is that this allows for eligibility for re-election with less danger. This is a point that I haven't really touched on yet here, and I just want to mention it a little bit here because it becomes more relevant when we talk about anti-federalist objections to the presidency. But the convention spent a long time debating how long the presidential term should be and whether the president could be reelected. If the president was selected by Congress, the consensus seemed to be that he should not be eligible for reelection, so that he would not govern simply to get reelected. He would not simply become a tool of Congress for the purpose of staying in power. But a lot of the delegates thought there was real advantage in having a president eligible for reelection as an inducement to good behavior. A president who knows that he may keep the job or lose the job is more likely to behave himself, to follow the rules, to act appropriately in the hopes that the people would return him to the office. And so this compromise allows for that eligibility for reelection without the danger of a president simply colluding with Congress to get there. So that's where the convention came out. Now, the Constitution as proposed by a convention was not a foregone conclusion. There was no guarantee that it would be ratified. In fact, the ratification fight was a very difficult fight. I don't want to go into that in a great deal of detail, but what I want to do is point out some highlights in terms of how the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, those who supported and opposed the Constitution respectively, um, felt about the presidential election process. I'm going to start with Alexander Hamilton because in Federalist 68, he writes that the mode of election of the president, quote, is almost the only part of the system of any consequence which has escaped without severe censure or which has received the slightest mark of approbation from its opponents. This is not quite true. There were a lot of anti-federalists who had concerns about how the president was elected, but I'll get back to that in a moment. But Hamilton is partially correct in that this was not nearly as controversial as one might expect. There was not nearly as much debate during the ratification as one might expect for something that has become as controversial as the Electoral College has become. And part of the reason for that is even anti-federalists could recognize that this was something of a compromise, that there were a few options, none of them particularly good, and that this might well be the best of the options. But I'll come back to that in a moment because Hamilton, in near the close of this essay, um, writes the interesting statement, this process of election, he writes, affords a moral certainty that the office of the president will seldom fall to the lot of any man who is not in an eminent degree endowed with the requisite qualifications. Now, I'll leave it up to each of you to determine whether you think that that has in fact been borne out by history, that we've had very rare cases where the president was not to an eminent degree endowed with the qualifications. But nonetheless, Hamilton is trying to essentially lay this out as not just the least of all possible evils in terms of how to select the president, but in fact a very good thing, that the Electoral College will give us good outcomes, not merely less bad outcomes. Um, it's a bit of a stretch. I mean, the idea that that demagogues, that others who might manipulate the people, that they couldn't be elected in this system. I mean, of course they could. People are able to manipulate electoral rules. That's just going to be the case in all cases, regardless of those rules. But Hamilton here is really, really trying to justify this in general terms and justify this as a positive good in the Constitution. James Madison tries to do the same thing. And in Federalist 39, he's very carefully adjusting the concept of a republic to try to fit the Constitution as written. And he does note that in a republic, the people have to rule, that power has to come from the people, and that the leaders should be chosen by the people. Well, of course, in the Constitution, the only leaders directly chosen by the people in the original version were the members of the House. The senators were chosen by the state legislatures. The president was chosen by an electoral college. And of course, the judges were chosen by the president with the approval of the Senate. But Madison adjusts this concept, and he suggests in Federalist 39 that it is sufficient for republic if the leaders be appointed either directly or indirectly by the people, either directly or indirectly. Now, in the case of the Senate, where the people elect their state legislatures elect their senators, that's an indirect election. That's a two-step election. In the case of judges, this becomes a real stretch. given the degrees in there. But with the president, it's not too bad. With the president, it works okay as long as you assume direct election of the electors, which of course the Federalists by and large were assuming. Now, of course, there was some apprehension among anti-federalists. Despite what Hamilton said, there was criticism of the Electoral College. For example, Cato, a prominent writer in New York, wrote, quote, "It is a maxim in republics that the representative of the people should be of their immediate choice." Here he's disagreeing with Madison, of course, suggesting immediate choice, not this directly or indirectly. But Cato describes the choice of the president as the people's choice at the fourth or fifth hand. He may be overcounting there a little bit, but on the other hand, it's distinctly possible the people elect the state legislatures select the electors essentially nominate for the House of Representatives, and then the House ultimately chooses. In that case, what we have is a four-stage process. You might call it five-stage because the people have to elect a House as well. So there we get fourth or fifth hand. But again, this was not the way that it was intended to work. This was the worst case scenario. Best case scenario, the people choose the electors vote for the president, the winner has a majority, and we're done. We have an indirect election, much like the election of the Senate. It's interesting to note, though, that Cato did not actually advocate direct presidential elections. He did not even offer an alternative. There were some anti-federalists, prominent among them Samuel Chase of Maryland, who would later become a Supreme Court justice. There were some who did advocate direct elections, but they were relatively few. There were some anti-federalists with distinctly democratic bents that wanted to see very, very popular elections. But overall, the anti-federalists didn't actually complain all that much about the Electoral College. I mean, they tended to say that it was not a great system, but they really didn't propose anything better. They really didn't have an alternative. They were in the same boat as the convention. We see this similarly in the extensive debate among anti-federalists over length of a term and especially the re-eligibility of the president. A farmer and planter, a writer in Maryland, I think undoubtedly spoke for many anti-federalists when he wrote, "A 4 years president will be in time a king for life." The presumption was that once in office, a president could simply keep getting himself reelected. That said, it's not entirely clear what the alternative is, what the other option is. Cato, for example, suggested the presidential term should be shorter than 4 years, that 4 years is too long. Agrippa in Massachusetts wanted annual elections, wanted a new president elected potentially every year. Still allow for reelection, but that way you have the president has to answer to the people frequently. Several anti-federalists, including prominently the federal farmer, suggested instead of changing the length of the term, just limit the president to a single 4-year term. Others thought that limiting the president to a single term had big downsides too. A Georgian, for example, suggested a rotation, that a president could be reelected indefinitely, but could only serve as president 4 years out of every 8. So every time a president was elected, he could serve one term, have to sit out the next one, and then could be elected again after that. George Mason went with a similar option, except he was willing to allow the president 8 years out of 12. After 2 consecutive terms, he would have to sit out a full term. Edmund Randolph of Virginia, who developed during this time a reputation for being incredibly indecisive, having favored a stronger national government, then opposed the Constitution coming out of convention, then later supporting its ratification, he merely suggested ineligibility after a given number of years, wouldn't pick a number of years. Several of the ratifying conventions proposed amendments to generate a rotation in office. In Virginia, which was copied by North Carolina, they suggested no more than 8 years out of every 15. New York wanted to go back to a single 7-year term without reelection. But the bottom line from all this is it's really difficult to draw a clear lesson. The anti-federalists are kind of all over the place. Other than the fear that the president would become too far removed from the people, there's broad consensus on that. But the question of what to do about it was not easy to resolve. This, like the question about the Electoral College, was a replay of the convention. All the ideas were bad in some way. Ultimately, of course, the Constitution was adopted without conditional amendments, which means the Electoral College went into place as soon as the Constitution was fully adopted in 1788. And between 1788 and 1789, we had the first federal elections. Um, in the first federal elections, both Federalists and Anti-Federalists recognized that the electoral system was potentially open to manipulation, just as any system is. But the fact that this one was somewhat complex meant that there were some different possibilities on how to do this. The fact that there was no precedent for it meant that it was much easier to try to shape things because no one could argue, well, no, that's not the way we've done it in the past. There was no past. We'd never done it before. And so what happened was the Anti-Federalists pushed to get someone like-minded elected to the vice presidency. Everyone knew that Washington would be the first president. There was no doubt of that. And ultimately, he was elected unanimously. Every elector voted for Washington and someone else. But the possibility of having one of the opponents of the Constitution elected to the vice presidency seemed to be there, but it never got organized. Part of the problem is that two of the anti-federalist states, North Carolina and Rhode Island, had not yet ratified the Constitution and thus did not get to vote. A third state, New York, failed to appoint any electors at all because of a dispute within the legislature. It is distinctly possible that the Federalists were deliberately trying to create a deadlock in order to avoid having New York propose an anti-federalist vice presidential candidate in order to oppose New York having electors choose an anti-federalist. And so in the end, the only known anti-federalist to receive electoral votes, Governor George Clinton of New York, received exactly 3 from Virginia. Some of the anti-federalists would have liked to see a more moderate candidate like John Hancock of Massachusetts, but the Massachusetts electors unanimously chose John Adams to pair with Washington. And so, of course, Washington, who most frankly saw as relatively neutral, even though he was very clearly a Federalist and a supporter of the Constitution, and John Adams, who'd expressed a great deal of support for the Constitution, despite being abroad serving as a diplomat during the time it was adopted, was made the vice president. But the more important and relevant element here is that 6 states out of the 10 that submitted electors gave the people a direct role in the process of selecting electors. I said before the framers had always intended for the people to be voting on electors. Well, 6 of these states let the people vote, and 4 of them, Virginia, Delaware, Maryland, and Pennsylvania, put the choice entirely in the hands of the people. 2 of those states did a statewide vote on a slate of electors, and the other 2 did districts. But the general point is that the people were highly involved, even in the first election, even when it was difficult to get some of this organized. A lot of the states that that the electors were chosen by the legislature actually did do popular elections 4 years later. The reason they chosen by the legislature initially was an organizational issue, not in opposition to the people's role or people's involvement. Now, this system ultimately only lasted 4 elections. The 1800 election kind of blew it up, but that's outside the scope of what I want to talk about here. But the general principles that resulted in this electoral compromise remained in place even after the 12th Amendment was adopted. A role for the people, which increased over time. Now, of course, all of the states have electors chosen by the people. They're chosen in the form of slates committed to a particular candidate, but it still is the people voting to determine how the state's electors will go. Uh, we still do have a degree of presidential independence. He's still not selected by any sitting office holders. Presidents still feel free to defy Congress as necessary because they're not beholden to Congress for their jobs. There still is a role for the states to preserve federalism, and the president still may be reelected. We have changed this, of course, and limited to 2 terms, but the idea of reelection is still reliant on securing the trust of the people rather than colluding with Congress in some way, which is what so many of the framers feared. Now, the Electoral College itself is constantly under fire, and people often point out its supposed mistakes where the popular vote winner lost the electoral vote. But it's important to remember that this is and always, in fact, has been a feature of the system, not a bug. One may not like this feature, that the winner of the popular vote doesn't necessarily win the election. But this is an intentional result of the system. You need to win a majority of the electors, not a majority of the people. Usually they go hand in hand. Historically, they've almost always gone hand in hand. And in fact, we've only had one election where a presidential candidate won a majority, not just a plurality, but an outright majority, and lost the Electoral College. And that was the highly disputed election of 1876. And so even in those cases where the Electoral College goes against the popular vote, it's usually going against a popular vote where nobody won more than half of the votes. Nobody won the majority of the people. Now, there's always been a compelling argument for direct elections. It goes all the way back to the Constitutional Convention. There's always been a compelling argument for legislative selection. These both are still very viable ways of selecting a president. And I'm not going to advocate any particular way here. I'm neither going to defend nor attack the Electoral College. I do just want to say in closing, point out that most of the time, the Electoral College really has worked just fine. It has worked the way it is intended, and it has endured. And it's created a great deal of stability. And oftentimes, it has created a more secure election by making the majority look larger, because electoral majorities tend to be larger than popular majorities. And so the Electoral College, I think, has served, for the most part, the purposes that the framers intended it to serve.